Always true.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Is that going to be?
Aaron Matej je kanadski novinar. Vodi emisiju Pushback sa Aaronom Mateom na nezavisnom news portalu Grayzone. A od 2022. je voditelj u podcastu Korisni, idioti. Matej je radio kao reporter i producent za Democracy Now!, Vice, The Real News Network i Al Jazeeru, a pisao je i za The Nation. U proteklih 11 mjeseci jedan je od sjevernoameričkih novinara koji su ključni u raspravi o genocidu u Gazi. Mr. Mate, welcome to Al Jazeera Balkans.
Nice to be here.
Very nice to have you with us. Let's start right away with our shared profession, with media and journalism. 11 months in, almost 12 months into the war. What are some key conclusions you could take away from the censorship we have all been faced with and the propaganda that has been let into the mainstream media platforms?
Well, it depends where you are. Where I am in the United States, the propaganda has been like nothing I've ever seen before. What you have in Israel is one of the world's most sophisticated militaries, pulverizing what is literally a death camp. 2 million people in Gaza are trapped. They cannot leave. Israel has openly said they intend to cut off water, food, fuel, medicine, and they've gone about systematically every aspect of Gaza's civilian infrastructure, schools, hospitals, mosques, shelters where people who have already lost their homes are trying to seek refuge. And the US media, nearly 1 year in, continues to portray this as some sort of defensive operation. And when US leaders get up and say that Israel has the right to defend itself, as Israel carries out massacre after massacre, this is portrayed in a very sanitized version as being a war between two equal sides. What it actually is a genocide. But unfortunately, because of how beholden the US media is to the Israeli state and the US government that is arming the Israeli state, the media is presenting the people who are paying for all this, which is US taxpayers, with a very biased, skewed picture.
In this context, you and your colleague Max Blumenthal a few months back were actually one of the debunkers of some of the Israeli propaganda that entered the mainstream. Here we're talking about cases of orchestrated policy by the Palestinian side, by Hamas, about the sexual assaults on the Israelis on October 7th. This is just one of the cases, but I would like you to comment on this, including everybody else who also has put so much effort into this debunking of these myths and these lies. How incremental is it to have these, in a way, activists who correct and rectify the lies that are being told to the wider masses?
Well, I don't consider myself an activist. I just think I'm doing the job that I'm supposed to do as a journalist, which is follow the facts. And in the case of Israel's claim, which was totally parroted across the US media, that Hamas committed mass sexual violence on October 7th, there just simply was no evidence at all. It's such an egregious case. And it follows in a pattern where whenever Israel wants to carry out some new atrocity, they always make some claim about the people they're trying to kill to justify it. And this is clearly what was going on here. We know that there were atrocities by Palestinian militants on October 7th. They're on camera. But Israel and its apologists were not content just to let that speak for itself. They fabricated claims about dozens of beheaded babies, about burned babies, and then about sexual violence. And the reason why I think they really pushed the sexual violence claim is because that's a very sensitive allegation. People don't want to be seen to be denying such a horrific crime. So when Israel said this, that this happened, everybody fell silent. And in fact, worse than that, major media outlets in the US went along with it. So for example, the New York Times published this really extensive article in late December purporting to show that Hamas carried out mass rapes. But if you look at it, there's no evidence whatsoever. There's no physical evidence. There's no forensic evidence. There isn't a single identified survivor of sexual violence by Hamas, dead or alive, not one. And in fact, the one person who the New York Times suggested was a victim, her family turned around and said that the New York Times was lying, that basically they had used her death to put a claim that just made no sense because they had actually spoken to her right before she was killed on October 7th. And there's no way there would have been time for her to be sexually assaulted in such a horrific way. So this story has really fallen apart because all there were to push this forward were people claiming to be witnesses of sexual violence. But if you read their stories, they didn't add up. They were contradictory. So somebody would say one thing, but then in a different story, they would say something else. And they would make outlandish claims for which there was no evidence. So for example, one of these alleged witnesses claimed that they saw 3 severed heads on October 7th. So if you're going to say, I witnessed 3 severed heads, the obvious question is, where are these heads? And the answer is they're nowhere because they were made up. And that's why there's no evidence to support that claim. So this is the basic kind of journalistic scrutiny that we did about these claims. And because we were in a very small group that did our jobs, we stood apart. And accordingly, the story has fallen apart. But it was used in a very cynical way because in the period that it was not challenged, Israel has used that claim to go ahead and carry out its actual atrocities. And still, you have people like Vice President Kamala Harris, who's now running for president. She still invokes that debunked claim to justify supporting Israel and all of its terrible atrocities. While meanwhile, the entire US media also ignores the only documented perpetrator of sexual violence, which is the Israeli military. And they've been caught now in multiple cases committing sexual violence against Palestinians. That also gets completely ignored.
Aaron, we talk about propaganda here, and you said something. You said that certain stories have fallen apart. So 11 months in, 12 months in, we have, on one hand, been seeing unprecedented crime on the Palestinians of Gaza. But at the same time, what we've been seeing when speaking about the Palestinian question, and something that we've all been following for the past decades, we are seeing cracks in the narrative. We are seeing the platforms, the mainstream, even mainstream Western platforms, inviting on voices such as yours and dozens of others, journalists and key role players in this conversation. Is the narrative crumbling, and how do you see the potential of this change that we are seeing?
I do think the narrative certainly is weakened, and for that I credit the people who have taken to the streets around the world protesting these horrific crimes. And when you have that many people speaking out, it's very hard for media to completely ignore them. And here in the US, where I am, you had this unprecedented wave of protest on college campuses, young students carrying a lot of risk to go out there, put their bodies on the line to camp out on their campuses to protest the Israeli genocide. And so that has forced the media to give voice to the people who refuse to let these crimes by Israel be committed in their name. But still, the foundational narratives around Israel and Palestine still very much persist. There's still this myth that it's the Palestinians that have always rejected these generous Israeli peace offers, which are as mythical as are the Hamas rape allegations. And because these narratives are so foundational to the whole apparatus that allows Israeli violence and occupation to continue, it's going to be a long time, I think, before those narratives at least are debunked in corporate media. But people are taking up the task of informing themselves on their own because they recognize that you just can't trust the media anymore, that the media is not there to inform people, it's there to propagandize people. So people are doing their own research, people are going to alternative sources of media. And that, to me, is the biggest way in which the narrative is collapsing.
So you mentioned the protests and the situation in the United States. Part of the protests were the people who have carried out a very significant part of the fight for the Palestinian cause, about raising awareness about the genocide in Gaza. Here I'm talking about the North American Jews and their role in all of this, especially in the context of Israel losing these American or Canadian Jews that usually would have been, or automatically by default would be considered to be on their side. How is this panning out at the moment, 1 year in, and how crucial have these voices, these Jewish voices, been for raising awareness about the genocide?
I've been involved in this issue pretty much my whole life. I grew up Jewish. I went to a Jewish summer camp, Jewish Sunday school, and I've never seen so much outrage among the Jewish community against Israel. And certainly when it comes to the younger generation, I think Israel has completely lost the younger generation. The generation that I grew up in, and people older than me, did have an attachment to Israel. A lot of that came from the legacy of the Holocaust and this belief that the Jews needed their own state of their own to protect them from such horrors ever again. But in the process, they blinded themselves to the horrors that they were inflicting on the Palestinians to create that Jewish state and to preserve it. But now I think young people have woken up to the reality, and there is a real shift there. And it's very powerful to see the images coming out of all the protests. Groups like Jewish Voice for Peace on Capitol Hill, occupying the Capitol Rotunda, being arrested in Grand Central Station. It's very, very moving to see this. And you see it spanning generations. You have Holocaust survivors taking part in these protests. My father is a Holocaust survivor, barely survived Nazi occupation as an infant. And it spans generations, people of that generation to very young people. It's very, very moving. And it does inspire hope.
You mentioned in the previous question, you mentioned these foundational narratives that are still very active. So here I want to ask you about, again, when we talk about the US and North America, where you come from, the role of Christian Zionism or Christian evangelicals in fueling this also propaganda but also financing of the Israeli state, of the Israeli Zionism that is behind the ideology behind the government and what the government of Israel is doing to the Palestinians. How maybe for our viewers who are not as familiar with this concept of Christian Zionism, can you maybe explain it a little bit and its importance in all that is happening in Gaza?
Christian Zionism is a critical constituency for Israel now, because Israel's lost so many other people around the world that they now have turned to the vital support, which has been going on for a long time, of this evangelical constituency that basically it believes in Israel because it basically believes that Israel needs to exist for Christ to return. And then once that happens, then basically most of the Jews in Israel will be exterminated, because that's the belief they have about Armageddon and the rapture. So that's who Israel now needs to rely on for support. And it's crucial. In Congress, you have a lot of Christian Zionists who are fanatic supporters of Israel. They vote every year to arm Israel to the teeth. And really, they are sort of advancing their prophecy, their goal of Armageddon, because what is Israel today? It's a completely fanatical state, off the charts in its extremism. It has nuclear weapons. It's a threat to itself. It's a threat to everybody around it. And it's encouraged to be so belligerent by this core constituency of Christian Zionists who have this vision of being Israel armed to the teeth, so that they can see one day Armageddon that they dream of. I mean, this is what Israel has become. This idea of a safe haven for the Jewish people has now become a threat to everybody, including itself.
I actually heard, I think it was Ilan Pape that said that actually the most dangerous place for Jews in the world is Israel itself.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a dangerous for everybody there, including Jews. And look at October 7th. Israel has, existed for decades now on this belief that it can just occupy the indigenous people of that land, steal their homes, not let them return, subject them to the longest running military occupation in the world, build up these massive settlements that make life in the West Bank for Palestinians impossible and make a Palestinian state impossible, put Gaza under siege, imprison people of Gaza so much that Israel can even control what they eat. So there's a former Israeli minister who talked about putting people of Gaza on a diet, by which he meant that the Israeli officials were going to calculate how many calories Palestinians could have without having a full-blown starvation crisis. So this idea that you can subject the people of Palestine to the world's longest running military occupation and that they're not going to fight back, that's what's guided Israel. And that's why there was October 7th. October 7th did not need to happen. If Israel simply followed international law, withdrew from the occupied territories, stopped the occupation, stopped the siege of Gaza, reach some sort of just resolution to the refugee question, October 7th never would have happened. But Israel, for so many decades, has been committed to supremacy rather than security. And this idea that you create a safe haven for the Jews has, in Israel, has proven to be a complete lie because it's based on occupation and supremacy. It's a threat to everybody's safety. And that's why you had October 7th happen. It should be stressed that Hamas, even members of Hamas, including Ismail Haniyeh, who Israel recently assassinated, they've said they're open to negotiating a two-state solution. Palestinians have been willing to accept a big compromise, just 22% of their historic homeland, a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. Even Ismail Haniyeh said that Hamas is open to that. Has any Israeli official, any Israeli leader across the spectrum ever said we should have a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza? No, they all claim the right to steal Palestinian land, build up these massive West Bank settlements that make Palestinian life impossible. And so when you have a situation when Hamas is more moderate than Israel when it comes to the foundational question of a two-state solution, you're going to have a situation like this because no Palestinian can ever accept being under occupation. And as long as Israel insists on occupation and supremacy, they're going to have resistance.
Speaking of resistance, let's compare the events of October 7th, so the Hamas attack on Israel, and go back to 2018 and 2019 with the Great March of Return, which were peaceful protests by the Palestinians of Gaza along the border with Israel. I repeat, they were peaceful. They were met with snipers and grenades and had dozens of people killed, hundreds wounded, including paramedics, journalists, children. What does this tell us about, we've heard in the past year, yes, but why would they commit such an attack? We go back 2 days before the filming of this interview, Francesca Albanese, the special rapporteur of the UN for the occupied Palestinian territories, has said that the Palestinians have a right to armed resistance, and this is something that is granted to every occupied entity on earth by international humanitarian law. So if we go back, what would be your response to the people who say they can protest peacefully, to the people who are not aware that Palestinians have tried every means available out there in the past 50, 60, 70 years?
Thanks so much for raising the Great March of Return, because it exactly answers the question of those who would dare now justify Israel's mass murder campaign in Gaza, that, where has been nonviolent Palestinian resistance. That's what the Great March of Return was. And it was met with an Israeli crackdown of snipers gunning people down, shooting at their limbs to leave people without limbs, with serious injuries, in some cases paralyzed. This was tens of thousands of people in Gaza after years of one of the most brutal sieges in human history, rallying for their basic rights, calling for an end to the Israeli siege, calling for their rights as refugees, because most of the people of Gaza are refugees or the descendants of refugees. They come from areas around Gaza, including that were attacked on October 7th. So Israel guns these people down. They still keep coming out with such courage, even in the face of these Israeli assaults. What does the rest of the world do back in March 2018 when this begins and in the months that follow? There was a collective yawn. Nobody cared. Nobody cared that Israel, with US-made weapons, was gunning down peaceful protesters by the masses. And so in that situation, when the world yawns at a massacre and a mass shooting of peaceful protesters, what are Palestinians going to conclude from that? That there's no hope for nonviolent resistance. Mm-hmm. They have to return to armed resistance. And it's not just the Great March of Return where Palestinians have tried nonviolence. What was the Oslo peace process? That also was an attempt at a negotiated solution. That's a case where the PLO, which became the Palestinian Authority led by Yasser Arafat, it recognized Israel. It recognized Israel within its 1967 borders. What did Israel do in return? It recognized the Palestinian Authority as the representative of the Palestinian people, but it didn't recognize the Palestinian right to a state. It didn't recognize international law, which says Israel has no right to a single inch of the West Bank or Gaza. And it proceeded to expand its illegal settlements in occupied territory. And when finally it came to offer Palestinians something, Israel gave Palestinians an offer that no Palestinian, even someone willing to sell out their own people, could ever accept, because Israel wanted to retain the major West Bank settlement blocks that make a Palestinian state impossible. And in return, it wouldn't even offer Palestinians an equal land swap. So if you're going to steal more Palestinian land in the West Bank, you at least should offer Palestinians an equal amount of land inside Israel. But Israel wouldn't do that. The ratio that was proposed at Camp David by Ehud Barak back in July 2000 was about 9-1. So we'll take 9 times the Palestinian land that we'll offer from Israel in return. Who could ever accept that? And yet throughout this period, US leaders like Bill Clinton and people in the media all said it's the Palestinians that turned down this generous Israeli offer. So the whole thing is so skewed. And Palestinians have learned from this that when they try diplomacy, when they try negotiations, when they try nonviolence, Israel just responds with brutality and more theft. And so in that situation, what are Palestinians supposed to do? And that's why October 7th happened.
Maybe for the end, I have a question regarding the BDS, so the boycott, divestment, and sanctions, the whole movement, which has, again, been present for years now and has had certain effects internationally, but has truly risen in the past year with the genocide in Gaza. Is this one of the ways to try to circumvent this double standards that are imposed on the Palestinians and on the whole dynamic of the conflict between Israel and Palestine? And can it be helpful and, in the end, effective?
It's certainly a legitimate way to resist. And again, it's another form of nonviolent resistance that the people who complain about Hamas also seem to hate. You know, people say that BDS unfairly singles out Israel. Well, yes, Israel's being singled out because it's carrying out the longest running military occupation in the world, and now a genocide. So it deserves to be singled out. And I do think it can be effective. It's a way to organize people. It certainly helped bring down apartheid in South Africa. And what Israel's doing is far worse than apartheid in South Africa. So certainly it's a legitimate target of a boycott movement. Whether or not it can be effective, Israel has a lot more power than apartheid South Africa did. It's a lot more embedded inside the U.S. power structure. It's a client state of the U.S. that is, you know, pretty much a U.S. military outpost at this point. So boycotts won't succeed alone in getting Israel to respect international law, but it certainly is an effective tool that everybody around the world can take part in. And amazingly, we've seen in response to it, again, rather than try to argue against it and make the case for Israel, there have been laws in the US basically trying to criminalize BDS, trying to make it illegal for people to practice their right to boycott an apartheid state, a genocidal state. So there are always challenges to activism when you're trying to do the right thing, when you're trying to stand on the right side of history. But BDS is certainly one of the ways in which you can do that.
Mr. Mate, maybe just for the end, a quick question. We don't have much time left. U.S. election is coming up. What impact do you think, and how much can they leverage the U.S. minorities, the minority voters, Muslims, Arabs, or anybody who considers this topic of the Israeli genocide in Gaza to be a deal breaker?
Well, unfortunately, in the US, we have a political system where both candidates have shown that they don't care about winning the votes of people who oppose genocide. It's basically a competition between Trump and Kamala Harris as to who can be more subservient to Israel. They both have major donors who give their campaigns tens of millions of dollars. And that has had an impact, I think. You know, Trump he brags about how he moved the US embassy to Jerusalem, how he recognized Israel's theft of the Golan Heights. And he basically said it's because Miriam Adelson gave him over $100 million. And a similar thing with Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris repeats the lies about Hamas rapes. She talks about Israel's so-called right to defend itself, which, of course, as Francesca Albanese says, Israel does not have. Occupiers don't have self-defense rights to defend their occupation. They have obligations to end the occupation. Kamala Harris says things like far too many Palestinians have died, which is actually, it's a statement that's meant to convey empathy, but it's actually profoundly racist. What does she mean by far too many innocent Palestinians have died? That presupposes that there's an acceptable number of innocent Palestinians that can be killed. She would never say the same thing about Israeli Jews. So we have, unfortunately, two candidates who don't seem to care about winning over the many people, not just Muslims and Arabs in the key swing states, but many people who are just outraged that their tax dollars are being used to fund this genocide. And accordingly, I don't see very much hope that things will change. The one positive I will say is that Joe Biden is a fanatical supporter of Israel. He has been his whole career. I don't think you can do worse than Joe Biden when it comes to supporting Israeli mass murder. So that is the one ray of hope in this U.S. election.
Thank you for finishing with a ray of hope. And thank you for speaking to Al Jazeera Balkans, Aaron Mate.
Thanks for having me.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Is that going to be?